to another session of Datna's tutorial series. Today we will be looking into the axial body cavities, the cavities within the axial body. The objectives are to define what a cavity is and to explore the different types of cavities within the body and the structures within these cavities. What does axial mean? Axial means the central part of the body. In this case, the axial body refers to the trunk, and the trunk includes the head, the chest. The trunk includes the head, the chest, the abdomen, and the pelvis, which means that we are going to talk about the cavities that we can see within this trunk, because we can also find cavities in the appendicular portion of the body, which includes the upper extremities and the lower extremities. What is a cavity? Imagine being in a room. A room has a space that contains your furnitures, your accessories, and this room is bounded by walls. We have the side walls, we have the doors, we have the roof and the floor. We can use the same concept to define a cavity in the body. A cavity is a space bounded by walls. In this case, some cavities may have anterior wall, posterior wall, the roof, and the floor, and lateral walls. And within this wall is a space that contains organs. So a cavity is a space that is bounded by walls. What are the two main types of cavities in the axial portion of the body? We have the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavities. Dorsal cavities are the cavities that are located in the back. The word dorsal means from the back. There are two cavities in the dorsal portion, in the dorsal part of the body. We have the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. The cranial cavity includes the brain and smaller cavities. These smaller cavities are the orbital cavity, which contains the structure of the eyes, which houses the structures of the eyes. We also have nasal cavity. Nasal cavity contains the structures of the nose. And we have the oral cavity. The oral cavity contains the structures within the mouth. So these are the smaller cavities that we can find in the cranial cavity. Cranial cavity consists of the brain and other smaller cavities, which are the orbital cavity, which houses the eyes, the nasal cavity, which houses the nose, and the oral cavity, which houses the structures that we can find in the mouth. Not only that, because the cranial cavity is a cavity, it is bounded by walls. What form the walls of the cranial cavity? We have the cranium, the aponeurosis. Aponeurosis is the fascia of the cranium. It is whitish in appearance. We also have the muscles and the meninges. These structures form the walls of the cranial cavity, and within these cavities we have these structures. Human beings are not cephalothoracic in the sense that our head is separated or demarcated by the neck. So let's talk about the spinal cavity. Spinal cavity is another type of dorsal cavity that is an extension of the cranial cavity. It is an extension of the cranial cavity. You can see this is a cranial cavity here. It starts from below the head and travels caudally. Caudally means towards the tail. It travels caudally by passing behind the thoracic cavity, passing behind the abdominal cavity, passing behind the pelvic cavity. That is why it is the longest cavity in the body. The spinal cavity consists of the spinal cord, which is this, the spinal cord, and the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid moistens the spinal cord. Both the spinal cord and the cerebrospinal fluid are within a space in the spinal cavity. That space is called vertebral canal. The vertebral canal is a canal that contains the spinal cord and the cerebrospinal fluid. So what forms the wall of the spinal cavity? The wall of the spinal cavity is formed by the spinal bones. You can see the bones. It's formed by the spinal bones. Now, let's discuss the cavities that we can find in the front part of the body. We have the thoracic cavity, we have the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is a cavity in the chest. The word thorax means the chest. Thoracic cavity consists of two other cavities. We have the pleural cavities. We also have the pleural cavities, and the pericardial cavity. The pleural cavities are the cavities within the thoracic cavity that house the lungs. They house the lungs. You can see? They house the lungs. They protect the lungs. And the pericardial cavity is a cavity within the thoracic cavity that houses the heart. It houses the heart. There's another portion of the thoracic cavity that we need to talk about. That is the mediastinum. The mediastinum. The mediastinum is the central part of the thoracic cavity. It is the central portion of the thoracic cavity. So in this diagram, where is our mediastinum? Mediastinum includes the central portion of the thoracic cavity. The central portion of the thoracic cavity. So this mediastinum separates the two lungs into right and left lungs. It also contains structures that are in the middle part of the chest. Can you tell me the structures that you can find in the middle portion of the chest? Don't forget that mediastinum is the middle portion of the thoracic cavity. So what structures do you think you can find in the middle portion of the thoracic cavity? We have the esophagus. We have the trachea. We have the two bronchi, the right and left bronchi. And most importantly, we have the heart. You can see that the heart is in the mediastinum. Heart is in the mediastinum. So if you want to describe the location of the heart in the chest, you can say that the heart is within the pericardial cavity, in the mediastinum, within the thoracic cavity. That is, the heart is protected by the pericardial cavity, in the mediastinum, within the thoracic cavity. Not only that, the thoracic cavity rests on a muscular muscular structure, on a muscular structure which is called the diaphragm. The diaphragm demarcates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. The contraction of the diaphragm allows the chest to move upward and outward during breathing. Look at me. When the diaphragm contracts, the chest moves outward and upward. And when the diaphragm relaxes, the chest moves inward and downward. So it is very essential in breathing. Diaphragm is one of the essential muscles of respiration. Overstimulation of the diaphragm, overcontractions of the diaphragm can result in hiccups. The thoracic cavity is also bounded by walls, because a cavity must be bounded by walls. What are the structures that form the walls of the thoracic cavity? We have the ribs, we have the sternum, we have the intercostal muscles. The intercostal muscles are the muscles that are between the ribs. We also have the diaphragm, we have the spine at the back. All these structures form the walls of the thoracic cavity. The next cavity to talk about is the abdominal cavity. The abdominal cavity. Abdominal cavity is the cavity that is just below the diaphragm. It is separated from the thoracic cavity by this diaphragm. Abdominal cavity contains peritoneal cavity. Abdominal cavity contains structures that are popularly known as the visceral. Even the structures within the thoracic cavity are also called visceral. Visceral organs. What are the structures you can find in the abdominal cavity? We have the liver, we have the stomach, we have the stomach, we have the stomach, we have the pancreas, we have the gallbladder here, we have the small intestine, and the upper portion of the large intestine. We have the kidneys, we have the spleen, and so many other structures that we cannot see, superficially. What are the walls that form the abdominal cavity. The walls include the skin, the muscles, and the fascia. So we have the anterior abdominal wall, we have the posterior abdominal wall. All these walls are formed by the skin, by the muscles, and fascia. The next cavity to talk about is the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is the continuation of the abdominal cavity. In many textbooks, these two cavities are joined together. They are described as one, while some textbooks describe them, differently, individually. But anatomically, pelvic cavity is a downward continuation of the abdominal cavity. What landmark do we use to separate the pelvic cavity from the abdominal cavity? The landmark is the iliac crest. The iliac crest is the landmark that we use to delineate the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity. What are the structures that you can find within the pelvic cavity? The structures can be gender-based, such as, for instance, in men, we have the prostate gland in the pelvic cavity. We have the seminal vesicles in the pelvic cavity. But in the female gender, we have the uterus, we have the fallopian tubes, we have the ovaries, we have the cervix, the vaginal cavity. So these are reproductive organs, which means that the reproductive organs are within the pelvic cavity. The structures that are similar in both genders include the lower portion of the large intestine, which are the sigmoid colon and the rectum. And we also have the pelvic muscles, which are similar or same for both genders. The urethra is the same, the ureters are the same for both genders. So this is the pelvic cavity that is separated from the abdominal cavity by using a landmark, which is the iliac crest. The iliac crest is here. So when you trace the iliac crest anteriorly towards the front part of the abdomen, anteriorly, that is where you will find the pelvic cavity, just below the line. So these are the cavities that we can find in the ventral portion of the body. That is, the ventral cavities are what we have just discussed. The ventral cavities consist of the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. What are the functions of the cavities within the axial body? One is that the body cavities help to protect the internal structures. For instance, look at these visceral organs in the thoracic cavity. The cavity helps to protect the lungs and the heart from external injury. Look at the abdominal cavity. For instance, it helps to protect the internal structures from external injury. How does it do that? Because the walls that form the cavities exert protective roles, exert protective functions for the structures within the cavities. For instance, look at our chest. It contains the skin, the ribs and sternum. Imagine we don't have this. Our lungs will be exposed, our heart will be exposed. Another function is that it allows compartmentalization. Body cavities allows the organs to be compartmentalized, to be separated into compartments, so that the organs within each compartment can have more room to grow, to develop, and to function maximally. Another function is friction reduction. Body cavities help to prevent friction because the cavities contain specialized fluids